side with families across the country to ensure every student has access to high quality education and opportunities, regardless of their race, income, color, and creed. With that being said, I'd like to formally begin our session by establishing some norms to help guide the tone and direction of the forthcoming conversation. All of our panelists today will agree how important norm setting is in order to have a productive discussion with both seasoned advocates as well as newcomers and those interested in the community for our cause. These norms include, but are not limited to, assuming positive intent. We like to create a safe space, embrace candor. This means both your successes and your challenges. Honor confidentiality. What's said here stays here. Keep discussions in the room and off social media. Expect and accept a lack of closure. And ask questions. Don't interpret or assume. That again goes back to assuming positive intent. We encourage your participation in this space. For security and logistic purposes, we have muted everyone, but we do welcome you to share other norms you may use with your sessions in the chat box below. And also, as you have saw, we are letting people in a waiting room. This is for added security as well. In the chat box, you will also find a link to a Google document where you can enter your questions for today's panel. Please read the instructions at the beginning of the document so we are able to address as many questions and thoughts as we can today. Our panelists come prepared to answer those questions and to have a dialogue and discussion. If you are having technical issues with accessing the document, please feel free to post your questions in the chat box, or you can message Haley Erlin, privately, and she'll be able to help you resolve those issues. With that said, I'd like to introduce our amazing panel and those people across the country who I get the pleasure of working with in the 50 Ken Network. Today we have with us Tony Williams from ConKen, Stephen Quinn from Georgia Ken. We have Aisha Herrera from Hawaii Kids Ken, and Shalonda Richardson of Tennessee Ken. These grassroots organizing experts come from an array of backgrounds that have allowed us to offer their unique touch to this work. Each of our experts work with educational equity, different stakeholders across the spectrum, from parents to community organizations to students themselves. Before we get started, however, we do have a poll question that will help us get some more insight on what are you feeling, what you believe the biggest challenge of advocacy is at this time. So I know that we are going to get that launched, and I want you to take a second to answer this question. How do you feel advocacy, or what the biggest challenge of advocacy is for you right now? You all can not see this, but I can. And we're getting some robust answers coming in, some that we imagine many of you are facing with and grappling with. You will see the results after this is, after everyone has selected their answers. So some of the big one that we see is addressing basic needs. We see it is changing how we do work, and we know our panelists will discuss part of that today. Also, the idea of social distancing. How do you do this when we cannot do what we're used to? We can't rent out a pizza room like my friend Steven is known for doing in Georgia, and filling a Pizza Hut with advocates, or for us, renting out a library in Dover with students and Black teachers of color talking about what it means to increase diversity, certainly. And then competing priorities. I see this every day in my work, and I know others see this. People are home, and more than ever, they are paying attention to what's happening. And there are tons of organizations trying to get their attention. So how do you balance that? Before we begin, thank you for that poll question. And it helps us get insight into where we want to go next. But before we begin, we want to take a moment to allow our panelists to introduce themselves. And during your introduction, I want you to share with those, how have you yourself changed as you approach the work? We understand that this is something that takes a inward change as much as a change in how we do our job, but then also how have you approached the work differently in this new normal? I'm going to start with Stephen from Georgia, if you can answer that question for us.
Yeah, I think my name is Steve. I'm actually down here in Georgia, and I think this has really changed the way we look at outreach in a very different way. I think embracing technology has been something that has been really different for me. I've been organizing for over, say, 10 years now almost. And so it's a different world, it's a different vibe, it's a different conversation. And so I think that's been one of the biggest things that I've been changed. But I think also really listening to families and knowing what their needs are and building that conversation has been something I've learned over the past few months.
Thank you. Shalonda, how have you adjusted during this new normal?
So yeah, to piggyback off of what Stephen is saying, what I did in order to pivot to digital advocacy, I sort of broke it down into 3 categories. First, I started with what were the needs of the community. And then I focused on the knowledge that the community would have pertaining to accessing the actual platforms, because there were a lot of people who were not familiar with how to use Zoom and how to access it and receive the resources. So that means that we had to then do things such as Facebook Lives and other demonstrations to connect with them so we could teach them how to access the platform. And then from there, I had to decide what would be the best time to meet with community members, because there were so many moving parts and so many different things going on in people's lives. We had to then figure out what would be the best time to connect with them. So just basically to further elaborate, I had to first ensure that the community had access to basic needs, and then create strategies to teach them how to log on. And then after that, just making sure that I continuously check with them to ensure that that was the best time to meet with them. So that's basically what I did.
Thank you. Tony, how are you adjusting?
So couple adjustments that come to mind, similar to what Stephen shared around just learning new tools, creating just a resource bank for myself and sharing that with my network of advocates. Organizing in digital age still comes down to relationships. And so, one adjustment I would say is just being more mindful and just connecting and checking in on peers, and also just staying connected and spreading the word on different events that we may be collaborating on or each other hosting. The other thing, adjustment that's been successful is It's just, we were doing a listening tour, and we've adjusted and now doing virtual listening tour sessions. But another adjustment is really expanding and being open to more diverse organizations. And so, you know, as a result of what's going on, being connected with organizations managing youth homelessness, organizations working on stronger communities through affordable housing, and how does that all connect to our education equity efforts, I would say, is another adjustment.
Absolutely. For those of you who are just joining us, we do have a Google document posted in the chat where you can fill out your questions that will be posed to the panelists. Aisha, I am going to pose the same question to you, but I'm also going to have you kick off our second question, which talks about technology access and competency for advocates. And have you seen any significant differences in technology access and competency for within your work, specifically given your location of Hawaii?
Aloha, everyone. Good morning. I'm Aisha Heredia with Hawaii Kids Can. So what we've done to pivot into this digital world is really a little bit of everything what the other organizers have touched upon, and be willing to meet people where they're at. So that means if somebody is not used to the platform you're using, take some extra time to check in with them, give them alternative access points. So if they're not used to the video conference of Zoom, remind them that there's the phone call-in portion. Also, having time to like really deeply connect. I know it seems like we might not have that in such a unforeseen circumstance, but I think people do appreciate having a little personal connection rather than just jumping right into the work. It helps them feel seen. It helps people like decompress from maybe a very stressful, odd day. And it creates that camaraderie that we wouldn't be able to have if we were face to face. So having like 5 minutes before your call to have like a informal check-in. With that said, the second question, how did we, what kind of technology access and competency differences do we see across our advocates? So we do work across 5 islands, and most of the time our advocates almost rarely see each other in person, but they're part of cohorts. So we do meet online. We have noticed in just the broader spectrum of the school district around us, Hawaii has a statewide school district, that there are pockets of a lack of access to Wi-Fi, a lack of access to computers and technological devices. So we did create a coalition of business leaders, teachers, and community stakeholders that are really adamant about closing this technological gap. And we named it Wi-Fi on Wheels because we realized, you know, empty school buses not being used at the time, we can outfit them with Wi-Fi. This was actually a model that we've seen across the states. We actually have a teacher who is keeping up with the Austin, Texas school districts because she has a colleague there, and they were running with it almost immediately upon school closures. And we reached out to them. We kind of created a sense of like, what were their pros and cons? And we leveraged our community of technologically minded stakeholders to commit to 1 hour a week check-ins to move forward with a timeline. So you also have to have like deeper commitments with actually meeting online. And we kind of surveyed who would be most able to run a pilot with something like this in maybe a short amount of time, within 3 weeks. We just kept up with each other more so than usual through like texting, meeting on our virtual platforms. I've done a lot of like Facebook messaging, a lot of Twitter messaging, more so than usual, just to keep up with everybody from this group that communicates on these multiple platforms.
Steve, can you tell us how, what does technology access look like, the competency look like for advocates, and is it still a problem for you, and how are you reaching these people?
I think similar to what Aisha said about the idea of, the internet access is really important. I think we are seeing in Georgia that there's a lot of lag in terms of broadband access. And so Zoom calls might not be the right avenue. And so incorporating that phone number and the PIN number to join a call is probably the most pivotal way. One thing that we started to do is record our calls and then share them out with advocates. And that's kind of been another way families can really kind of tune in. And one, if a parent has to hop off to take care of something, or they can't always sit through the full hour-long call, it's a way for them to kind of get the information at their own pace. And then I think too, it's just figuring out what parents really are in need of. And like Aisha said, I think those one-on-one meetings were really powerful for us. Like that gave us opportunities to give insights on like what was needed, technology and et cetera, and really having that conversation with them. And it also gives a build of an opportunity for relationships that we've been cultivating for years to really solidify them even more.
Yeah, relationships are super important, and particularly making sure we like to call them everyday Delawareans, but everyday people who may not have the same level of access to a lot of these. Before we go to the next question, I want to make sure, and I see so many of you doing it already, we want to keep this energetic and interactive. So please make use of the chat function, thumbs up, like, +1, something you hear the panelists say that really sticks to you. Share a personal anecdote in the chat box. We look forward to those sort of things. We understand that it's not enough just to adjust how you do the work personally, but the way you go about it changes in this new normal. And I want to hone in on some tactics that you all utilize throughout your time. And Stephen, we ended with you, so I'm going to start with you. What tactics have been working well in the field, and which haven't?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest tactics that we tried, and I think this is actually really a simple tactic, is really listening at the end of the day. Like I will say, like more than ever, when this all happened, we were in the middle of legislative session and we transitioned to becoming a resource for parents. And one of our biggest pieces of the puzzle that we found was that parents were inundated with resources like the first few days of school closures. And one of our parent fellows said to me, they were like, "Hey, Stephen, we just need some guidance." And so that kind of led us to really kind of crafting conversations or virtual meetings, like parent support conversations that really were meaningful to families at that time, because we were listening to what their needs were in that conversation. I think other tactics that have been really successful is just super amount of over communication about our calls and information out there, because there's so much things going on in this world every day. And so being able to really communicate via like texting, email, Google Calendar alerts, and then I think also using internal ways. Like we had a call recently last week or 2 weeks ago, I think it was on summer learning. And we had, I think 58 parents RSVP, and we had over 80 on the call because parents were sharing it internally. And so I think utilizing your base and your power of your base is super powerful. And like, that is a way that if you are over communicating and sharing what you're doing, they're going to be listening and they're going to be taking notice of it, and they will demand more action. I think we get a lot of times where we're like, "Hey, we're going to have 2 calls a month," and we've gotten a lot of pushback recently because they're like, "We want these calls." So I think it's a great way to target those ideas that we're working towards, and ensuring that it's important for families too.
Yeah, and Tony, I want to go to you here. how are you seeing the tactics you use in the field adjust? In particular, I know here in Delaware, as we all spoke about, changing from a resource, changing from directing people to action to being a resource, and now trying to re-engage them can be difficult. How are you doing that?
Well, I would say I'm doing it with the peers in our network. I want to just give a shout out to Grow Hartford Youth, Norwalk Acts, Connecticut Parents Union, Race and Waterbury Bridge to Success. And, you know, a way of managing and pivoting is collaborating and working together and figuring out what exactly our advocates are needing at the time. And also continuing, we were planning, and before COVID, advocacy trainings and ways to kind of just train advocates to have more impact on a local and state level. And we've adjusted and started looking into figuring out how to hold those virtually. Another thought that comes to mind is we've been intentional about our target outreach and our audience. And so we've held virtual calls, the same call for Spanish, with a Spanish translation. We did that with Norwalk Acts and Building One Community in Stamford. And so, you know, we were doing that again before the digital advocacy efforts, and just really committed to continuing the work, basically, and grateful for our community organizations that we partner with and work with.
In that vein, around things are changing. We're no longer in person. Shalonda, one of the questions we hear a lot about is how do you manage interactive discussions or energetic discussions in this space? Educators are asking that question. Other advocacy organizations are asking that question. How do you in Tennessee particularly go about keeping the energy alive?
So the number one thing I would say, in agreeing with what Stephen stated, I would say listening first. You really need to listen to the community members and figure out what it is that they really need. That's the most important. Another thing I would say is experts. We've had experts on our panel. We've done our virtual parent connection call for the past 13 weeks. I partner with an organization called the Memphis Lift. So partnerships are always really, really important. Polling, education games, different topics every week, that's important as well. And then just making sure that you always go back to your advocates and you kind of do a pulse check to ensure that the information that you are providing them with is really what they are seeking. That's always important. And we do something that's called a Zoom buddy. So we always, on every call, ask people to bring a buddy along with them the next week. We do it the same time every week, which is Tuesdays from 6 o'clock to 7:30. We found that that was the best time for all of our advocates to access our meeting. And we make sure we let students lead as well, because students are at the core of what we're doing. So when I say experts, I don't mean just healthcare professionals or teachers. We make sure we have students and parents on our panels as well. So when people see that, you know, you really care about them and you're trying to reach every corner of the community, that really bonds them together, and they want to continue to attend your meetings, advocate for improved K through 12 education policies, and then they just want to really keep going on and fighting for equitable education for students.
I want to shout out Shalonda. You work with some amazing students out there in Tennessee. We were just on a youth national call with some of our youth groups that we work with. And you could really see that they're primed and ready during their calls. You've prepped them really well. And I think to that point, managing energetic discussion flow, the folks that you know are going to jump on the call that you can see leading the call, give them an opportunity to shine, maybe text them in advance and prep them like, hey, I think you'd be really great talking about your work here, or how you did this and this last week. Feel free to speak your mind.
Thank you so much for that, Aisha. Just one other thing that I would say that you could do, we also do something called a sunshine report, in which we let the members on the call share anything positive that happened to them that week. So that's always really good. And we also allow people to join the calls to spotlight. Sometimes we have parents do our review from the previous week. So it's just always good to have people to interact. And to that point that Aisha stated, I usually work with students of all ages. The youngest student I've worked with is 8 years old, because I believe the earlier you start, the better. So I always involve elementary students as well. And people are always excited to hear what they have to say.
Yeah, I just want to share and thank Shalonda. The group that we had on Monday, one of her students was in the 5th grade. I think it's Keziah, and I'm like, I want to be on a campaign so that Keziah runs for governor. It's going to happen. It's going to be in there. I think another point around energetic flow is making the conversation relevant to the audience. And we at ConCan try to, our efforts are statewide, but we take the time to develop relationships in cities and towns that we're working in, and also including that information in our virtual sessions so that it's relevant to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not enough just to be a offer tangible resources to individuals, but we definitely need to make sure that we're giving them something more than just that. I want to transition to looking ahead. Folks are here to hear from you about what does it look like after a virtual gathering? What do the next steps look like for advocates after a virtual gathering? And Tony, you started to hit on it briefly, but I want to tee this up for you and hear, how are you thinking about this and moving your advocates along?
Sure. So one example comes to mind. We have the opportunity of working with Grow Hartford Youth Program. They do work on food justice in Hartford in their schools. And so we did a power mapping session with them. And from that power mapping session, they were able to come up with the targets of influencers that they wanted to invite to a virtual call to share about their campaign, and also make an ask to get some state and local elected officials more involved and engaged in a community conversation in the fall. So after the power mapping conversation, we were able to convene, and included were the mayor, the State Senator McCory, who's head of the Education Committee, and Common Council members, and other students from other organizations. And so they were able to present their campaign, get more collaboration and buy-in, and had a council member, had a Board of Ed member commit to follow up and engaging in a meeting. The students after that virtual meeting took the time to, we just kind of debriefed, and then took the time to follow up with direct emails and calls to individuals that they invited, in particular with some elected officials in the work that we're looking to accomplish upcoming session.
And can I
The
ask,
idea is that there's, it's not just a gathering or a training just for it to be a training. We look to, build power and remind folks what it means to build powerful advocacy campaigns.
Thank you. And before Aisha goes, I do want to remind you, for those listening, please drop your questions. We are approaching the audience question section, and we want to make sure we are prepared to answer anything you throw at us. Aisha, so your thoughts on this topic?
yeah, I'm super excited about this question because part of the work that we do as outreach is to kind of realize our potential for people moving up what we call this ladder of engagement. So if Andy, our wonderful tech guru, can show, when I host an event, whether it's digital or in person, I always have this ladder of engagement in mind. In the in-person world, you might find talking one-on-one to somebody that they want to be more engaged with your organization or even take a training with you. I guess in the digital space, what I look for is somebody who's like really into the discussion, who leans in, who asks questions, and then I link up with them after the virtual discussion. So kind of engaging with people that you see have increased interest, and then kind of bringing them up to, hopefully if they come to several of your meetings, to come to a place where they they feel welcome to take a training. I mean, I hope they always feel welcome to take a training, but feel confident that they could enter this kind of new role of being a participant to actually engaged in a session with you for something like a boot camp or a succession training that we have. You see in Delaware with their Move and Wave, what we have here in Hawaii. And like what Tony was talking about with all of our work, especially what we're gearing up for elections, we know elections are coming in the fall. So we'll host a series of gatherings in the summer to lead up to elections, to hopefully give space for the people who have attended to kind of level up and decide, like, do I want to engage with our lawmakers or candidates in the future session in the fall, to actually like have their voice at the table. So this is that secret ladder of engagement that I always have in the back of my mind, but it's not a secret. You all could use it as a tool as well.
Yeah, you know how I think about this. It goes back to me to a concept of organizing versus mobilizing, and in my case, organizing and how I look at it is, in order to be an effective organizer, to build advocate capacity, you really have to create power within an individual person. It's about how do you, and in this space it's more difficult, right? Because in our case, we're very hands-on with our advocates. And just yesterday, I was on about 10 different advocate calls as they're trying to respond to their schools issuing statements around diversity, equity, and inclusion, et cetera, given all the recent events. And I was thrilled that it wasn't me reaching out to them. It was them saying, Daniel, we know we need to do something, and I want to take this action, right? That showed me that we had prepared them to take charge over their advocacy. But in the same vein, since I've been thinking about how do we do that electronically in the virtual space, and a lot of times it's not as easy because it's more intense, right? Like this is combing a Zoom webinar and saying, who's that person who offered that comment? Let me write their name down. I may not know them, so let me stalk Facebook to try to see if they're connected to us or not, right? It's more intense. And I think what I want people to sort of walk away with in this section is, like, it's important to organize versus be an organizer versus a mobilizer. And organizers inherently build power within people to take action on their own, but also to be prepared to buckle up because the work is hard, right? And it can be more trying if we don't put all of our effort into it and pay close attention. But I want to get to sort of what does the future of community organizing look like with that segue that none of you asked for. What does the future of community organizing look like, and how do you go about? Aisha, you touched on it briefly. Tony, you touched on it in your last statement briefly. But Shalonda, I'm interested in seeing, how do you think about the future of organizing in a digital space?
So when I think about the future of community organizing, I think about it as a hybrid model in which the advocates will have an opportunity, of course, to choose when the world opens back up, and whether or not they will want to stay digital or they will want to go out and meet in person. So I always focus on people's strengths and also barriers that they might encounter when it comes to advocacy. So for instance, you might have an advocate that doesn't have any transportation and maybe they can't meet you in person. But since we have been doing those calls for the past 13 weeks, you know, it's like people are Zoom experts now. So if we wanted to continue to meet on Zoom, we could do that. And so with that being said, if you needed an advocate to write a letter or call a legislator, I could just simply share my screen. You know, I could walk them through those examples and they can jump into action immediately. It wouldn't be like, oh, okay, we're going to meet in person on this day and then I'll follow up and then we'll do this. They could just automatically do it. And another thing that I think about when this all happened, normally everyone was able, or normally everybody thought about work as 8 to 5, you know, things of that nature. But now in this particular space, it's not like that. People might call you at 11 o'clock. They might call you at 4 o'clock in the morning, you know, asking questions as it relates to advocacy. So you have to, of course, be more open and just expect people to just call you, you know, at any time that they feel necessary. So it goes back to relationships, of course. And that's the most important thing, to continue to build and strengthen relationships. And I feel like that would really, of course, help propel you forward. So that's what I think the future would look like.
I really like what you said, Shalana, about hybrid. I feel like post-COVID, it's kind of hard to go back when you have a situation like you explained, like if it's more convenient for a parent or a student to call in rather than drive halfway across the state to meet you. And I think that will increase our reach even more, the in-person plus the digital put together.
Yeah, I know we have some audience questions and we have some other prepared questions. I do want to get to that real briefly. I know y'all are chomping at the bit to answer some more questions. So the first question we have is, after a few months of digital organizing, what do different advocates feel virtual outreach really can't replace? Can this be solved for, or do we have to simply accept it? And I pose that to any one of you. You can take yourselves off mute and answer. I'll restate the question. After a few months of digital organizing, what do different advocates feel virtual outreach really can't replicate? And we've been trying to grapple with some of that. Can this be solved for, or do we simply have to accept it?
I kind of like chime in here for a second. I think maybe this is weird to me, but I don't think there's really been much change. I mean, we're still building relationships in this work and we're still doing this community organizing effort. I mean, the thing that it can change, like, I think the idea of this, of like, that can be solved in some capacity is just, I think, access to resources really at the end of the day. But I haven't, even in this like past 3 months, I think the work just continues. It's just, we're meeting on a different platform and we're still connecting and we're still listening and we're still building advocacy. And I think we're building even more work in our space. I think to your point, Aisha, about going to meet families across the state, right? Like I've connected with more families than I've ever before in the past three months. So I don't necessarily, I think it hasn't really changed. That's my thoughts on this. I definitely let anybody else want to chime in on that. I think that's my first thoughts around it.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Stephen. I mean, I don't think it's changed. I think it's actually helped in a way, because when I think about education, of course, it spans across all careers. So I think oftentimes when people think about education advocacy, they might think about, you know, parents or teachers in this space, and maybe they might not think about healthcare professionals or, you know, business workers. But I think about like involving all of us, because it takes all of our voice to be able to advocate for educational equity. And, you know, maybe you did want to meet with a doctor, but a doctor had like a really tight window or space and they couldn't meet you at that time. But if you say, hey, can I send you a Zoom link, and you know, they're on the Zoom call, then that's like completely different, and you're tapping into a completely different world.
You know, Daniel, what also comes to mind is, oh gosh, I can't remember the title. It's Mark's Advocacy Labs. It was the thing, a little opposition isn't a bad thing, or a little opposition is a good thing. And the idea is that sometimes you're organizing with peers, you're expanding your network, and you know, what does it mean to create a space for the collective audience that you're reaching out to, and you know, being comfortable with a little discourse, you know, not having to, you know, your way isn't the only way, and what does it mean to, you know, have a little healthy tension as we work together to create a meaningful experience for the advocates that we're working with.
Yeah, as I think about it, we give a lot to how do we build a communal feel with our advocates, and to give a concrete way how we've done it. We have adjusted to using more GroupMe, WhatsApp, Slack communications internally, and really paying attention to that. I want to, and Aisha, I'm bringing this next question to you from the audience. Because I know it's something you taught me just this week about a new system for engaging advocates. With the limited budget for digital tools we all use them, what do you feel are the highest impact ways to teach diverse audiences and encourage action?
Right on. Thanks, Daniel. So it's kind of, this might answer the last question in this question. What are we missing right now is that kind of like, I feel the spark of being in person and having this sense of like, we're working together, we have ideas, let's throw them out. It's kind of harder on Zoom because we're like waiting for each other to stop talking before we start talking. So I just like Googled a bunch of like free apps or web-based apps that's easy to just like, when you click a link, you'll go to the app on your desktop. And one of them is really fun, called Padlet. And it kind of lets you post Post-it notes on this like board that everybody who clicks the link sees. So it's a great brainstorming tool. It's also a great way to like have an in-depth discussion. If you give the room or your meeting like 5 minutes to answer something in-depth in their note, you'll see it in real-time answer. And then you can talk to the room about all of the things that people just wrote in. It's different from reading the chat box because you kind of lose things in the chat box over time. So when you're looking at something like that, it's a really great digital tool. Padlet, I'll put it there in the chat box. So yeah, just like, don't be afraid to test things. Like if you know you have a big meeting coming up, Google like free tool for collaboration. And then just try something out. We found out about Padlet through a teacher who used it in their digital learning space, and it was pretty awesome.
Steve, the second part of this question talks about digital tools / ads, and how do you use that to reach people. And I know you are using a lot of digital tools. Do you find some work better with certain audiences than others? And if so, how do you decide which ones you utilize?
Yeah, I think you're right. I actually, Padlet's a great resource. I just learned about it this week too as well. I think that's a great way to like also create like messaging boards. But I think text messaging has been incredible on our end. Like we have seen a lot of people embrace that way, and then opting into it. Like so, building our base. So creating a keyword to text in to get to the link to the call. We are doing an email guide right now around summer learning, and so we're putting out like a weekly like email resource that parents are submitting to us, that are saying, hey, these are the things my kids are using, and we're building narratives around that conversation, and which is bringing more people into our calls. And I think the other way is like word of mouth. Like that's the best way at the end of the day. Like if you have really solid advocates, they're going to communicate about your mission because they're your spokespeople at the end of the day, right? They're telling us about like, listen to this call that you're on, right? I mean, I think Shalonda said this in the beginning of this organizing, like the more we do this, the more people are gonna hear about it, and the more they're gonna join our calls, and it's gonna get bigger and bigger. And I think that is a really great way to utilize in that space. I know the platform that we use here in our space is Hustle to do that peer-to-peer texting. We actually have a team of Hustle parents that hustle others. Like they actually love it. They're like, can we do Hustle instead of phone banking? But I think it's kind of one of those great tools that I think people should be utilizing more than ever. And make it personal. Like use emojis, use like stuff that sounds similar. Like you don't like sound like a robot. I mean, we're always a fan of the pizza emoji here in Georgia because we work in do all of our means of Pizza Huts. But I think it's a good opportunity to really kind of build that connection in that space.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as we are getting closer to time, I know for us in Delaware, we spend a lot of attention in the legislative session, et cetera. And with all this, legislative sessions have been completely appended. But for those of you in states where legislative sessions have been put on hold indefinitely, how do you keep state reps, or maybe not indefinitely? I know ours is just going back. But how do you keep state reps who may be meeting virtually in committees engaged and focused on your policy reforms? How are you engaging your state legislators right now during this change in session?
So I know for us, we invited our legislators on our call, and we had a panel of students set up for one of our legislators, and they posed different questions, different policy questions to them. So that worked out really well. And then we also had another call where we had a panel of legislators on, and the community was able to ask them different education related questions, of course. And another thing that was really good, because I always think you should like humanize the situation. As Aisha said, we're not in person. So it's just, kind of how to keep that spark or that feel. So I always wanted to feel homey, and I want people to feel comfortable. So we did like this Jeopardy trivia game, and the legislators played as well. And the community members were so excited because we always do like different games on our calls as well. And they were just like, we can't believe they stayed on the call. They were there the entire time, and they played with us, and they were so excited. So it wasn't so much of, how sometimes you meet with legislators or community members could be really nervous, and they don't know what to do. But when we played that game and they were able to see that, hey, we're a community, we're all in this together, they were really excited about that. So we just continue to engage them on our calls, and just continue to make sure that we connect them with the community.
That's awesome, Shalonda. I really like that game idea. Like that just makes me want to like build it out a little bit more. We've done some stuff where we've done like one-on-one interviews with actual like lawmakers, but we did one where we actually had a community meetup with a school board member, which led us to getting some digital learning days in that district to include the calendar, because a parent spoke up on the call, and the school board member felt like it was something that she should fight for when she's hearing it from the community. And really what we found in that space was that parents are more willing to speak up, especially in this power conversation right now, because they are so close to kids' education. And they feel like it's an opportunity to say, hey, this is not right. I want to see something different. And when you put them in a room with power or someone in power, they're going to talk and they're going to say what they want to say. And I think that's just evident with like even just building that conversation out, which I think is a really, really good opportunity for families.
We have another audience question, but I know particularly in Connecticut, you all did something around this topic of engaging legislators virtually. Could you spend a minute talking about that, Tony?
Thanks, Daniel. We had, before COVID, we held a legislative networking event where we invited grassroots and local advocates and invited legislators to join and connect in an informal setting. And then post-COVID, the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, of which we partner with regularly, held a education virtual town hall, of which our executive director, Sabira Gordon, was on that panel. And that was another means of engagement, but also we were able to help people drive, because it was a series of virtual town halls, and we were able to drive some folks to participate and engage there.
And the next question, I think we've talked about it a little bit, but one I always think about is how have the number of advocates in your work either increased with virtual organizing, and then how deep are those relationships? And I want you, and whoever answers this question first, I want you to sort of talk about this idea of quantity versus quality of advocates. We certainly think about it here, but I'm curious to see how are you grappling with it in your work? And I can restate the question too. Has the number of advocates you are working with increased via virtual connections? If so, how deep are those relationships? How do you keep, retain, communicate, etc.?
I could start off that one. So Hawaii, we are a smaller state. We do hope to build quality advocates. We are seeing an increased amount of people attending our meetings. But what I think helps is like the one-on-one connection after the meeting, kind of make note of that person's name. If they had to register, you have their email or their cell phone number, and just kind of check in with them like, hey, I noticed you said this and this during the call. Like, do you want to talk to me more about that? And kind of like find a way to connect with them one-on-one. And then kind of building that trajectory through the ladder of engagement on how they can be more involved. We do work on 5 different islands, and we don't necessarily see people in person regularly, regardless of COVID. And we've kept up through a lot of social media. Like, I think I'm friends with so many teachers on Instagram and Twitter that hear about our events more so than like my flyer being passed around through email. Like, they see it on Instagram and Twitter, and they direct message me like, hey, I saw this, how can I join it? Or like, are you going to talk about this and this and this? And I'm like, well, we'll definitely talk about it if you want us to talk about it. Like, that's the beauty of social media too, is kind of tap into what's being said around you, and most likely other people will want to hear or talk about it as well.
Yeah, I think Aisha, you're right about the relationships and the one-on-ones. Like, that is like the way that those relationships get built out. I can agree with that with so much more. I think too, like, I think it's building that power discussion, right? Like letting them lead on calls, letting them be a part of panels, like encouraging them to write op-eds. Like, those are the things that I think parents just, we sometimes they just don't know where to start. And just, if you give them the idea, they'll take it and run with it. I mean, I will say, like, we had a parent who was really upset about the restart of schools task force. And she was like, what can I do? And I was like, well, just call the governor's office. And she drummed up 50 parents to call throughout the week. And I think those are things that we are seeing more and more of, right? Like, I think back to your point, Daniel, about this idea of like, they're reaching out to us. Those are the people you want to continue to build and support with. And then the people that are coming back to your calls, like, they're there for a reason. And we just have to figure out how to connect with them individually. It just takes time. There's only a few of us in this world. And so the more we do it, it's more powerful.
Yeah, I completely agree with Stephen as well. Like we've all stated, relationships, that's key. And it's so important to have quality advocates. So basically, I always think about building a strong foundation. So continuing to keep connect with them one-on-one, because once those quality advocates have their strong foundation, then when new people come in, they can welcome them, they can help them out with things, they can show them different things. So that's always really important.
And building off of that, Shalonda, you know, having strong advocates who are, you know, issue focused. And I'm just mindful of upcoming elections as well as, you know, state and national, and just keeping the momentum of reminding some advocates, you know, why not you? You might be someone who could, you know, that ultimate advocacy opportunity is running for something and representing people's voices, and look forward to building and finding those individuals that want to take it to that level.
And it's always so exciting, just to piggyback off what you're saying, Tony, because you're like, they were with me, I know them, you know, they're a part of CONCAN, they're a part of Tennessee CAN, you know, so it's just like so exciting when you do that. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I second everything you all have said. And in particular here in Delaware, we keep an acute focus on what we call the individual leadership plans. Not something we created, but we were inspired to utilize this, so we actually can hone in on what do specific advocates have of interest, and then what are the mechanisms we can use to build that interest. And we've gone so far as creating an advocate checklist that consists of 11 actions that are built to increase the agency of these individuals. And it's almost like a competition. People are checking off and saying, Daniel, I got 5. How many does so-and-so have? And this time, well, I felt like a little competition is always good. I just want to take the time to say thank you to all of you who joined, and thank you to our panelists who joined. We know we did not get to all of the questions that were answered, so that were asked, so we do apologize. But we find this is really valuable, and this space of COVID and distance learning, and we're all across the globe or in our individual corners within our states. It allows for you to be creative and think of new ideas and new approaches to the work. And if you left with nothing else here today, is that try something new. Try something you haven't tried before. Have a conversation with your advocates or your members about what they would like to see happen during this time. And I guarantee you they'll blow your mind. They certainly blow my mind constantly. But be innovative, search out new solutions, and don't let the digital divide be a reason why you're not connecting with people. This is a time to build power in our advocates. This is a time to build power pointed towards action for our advocates. It doesn't matter how much training we give them if they're not going out and seeking the change that's necessary. And I urge you to join them on that path and help them get there. So thank you for joining our call. There will be a post-survey going out. We would love to hear what other sort of organizing sessions you would like to have and other tips you would like to learn. We're here to be a resource in the 50 CAN network, and we're grateful for everyone who joined us today. Thank you.